At the Battle of Vercellae, a Cimbrian army was completely annihilated, leaving 100,000 men dead in the dirt. That's an almost unimaginable amount of bodies. Now comes a question modern audiences rarely ask. Who cleaned all this up? In antiquity and the Middle Ages, the aftermath was often chaotic and grisly, with survivors, scavengers, animals, and the elements themselves left to do the work. In this video, we'll explore the fate of battlefields after the battle, how they disposed of the dead and the debris, and why the aftermath of pre-modern battles often remained a haunting sight for years. In the ancient world, handling the dead after battle was as much a religious obligation as a practical one. The concept of giving fallen warriors a proper burial was deeply ingrained in cultures like those of Greece and Rome. For ancient Greek armies, it was common to arrange a truce to collect the fallen. For example, after the Battle of Cannae in 338 BC, where Philip II of Macedon defeated the Athenians and Thebans, both sides reportedly were able to handle their dead according to their customs. In Greek literature, leaving a body unburied was seen as a terrible dishonor. Thus, Greek victors often allowed the defeated to retrieve and bury their slain, as a basic decency and as an acknowledgement of defeat. Greeks often cremated bodies on pyres built on the battlefield or nearby, then collected the ashes for burial. In other cases, bodies were interred in large communal graves near the battle site. After the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, the Athenians buried their dead heroes in a mound right on the battlefield, which can still be seen today. The corpses of the defeated Persians were said to have been left exposed initially, perhaps buried later in mass graves, though accounts differ. Generally, victors took care of their own dead as a point of honor and religious duty, while the enemy dead received less care. When we turn to ancient Rome, we see a similar pattern of pragmatic respect for the fallen, at least for Roman troops. The Roman legions made efforts to recover and bury their dead after battles, whenever possible. Proper funeral rites were important to Roman morale. Roman soldiers feared dying unburied in foreign soil, and commanders sometimes went to great lengths to prevent that fate. An example comes from the aftermath of Rome's disastrous defeat in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD. 3 Roman legions were annihilated by Germanic tribes, and the Romans were initially unable to tend to the dead. Years later, when the Roman general Germanicus finally marched back into that area, he found a horrific scene. In the center of the field were the whitening bones of men, as they had fled or stood their ground, strewn everywhere or piled in heaps. Near them lay fragments of weapons and human heads, nailed to trunks of trees. 6 years' exposure had left the corpses skeletal. Germanicus's troops, deeply moved, gathered and buried the bones of their fallen comrades. An account by Roman historian Tacitus said, "Not a soldier knowing whether he was interring the relics of a relative or a stranger, but looking on all as kinsfolk." In the case of the Battle of Vercellae, ancient sources tell of farmers who used the bones of the fallen tribesmen to erect fences to protect their crops. And for years thereafter, the region experienced extraordinary harvests, largely thanks to thousands of rotting bodies fertilizing the farmers' lands. Centuries later, the Eastern Roman Byzantines explicitly recommended this practice in their military manuals. Emperor Leo VI's writings specifically instructed generals to take special care to bury their own dead, but to leave the bodies of the enemy as they are, in order to unnerve the foe. Some ancient battles ended with thousands of bodies simply abandoned on the field, especially those of the defeated side. If neither the defeated nor the victors bothered to bury them, nature was left to take its course. Scavengers like wolves, dogs and vultures would pick the battlefields clean in time. Bones might bleach under the sun for years, a ghastly memorial of the fight. That said, most ancient battles did not result in a permanently corpse-strewn wasteland. Victorious armies had incentives to at least clear the battlefield short-term, primarily to loot and to avoid disease. The first people to clean up after a battle were often the soldiers and camp followers on the winning side, who swarmed back onto the field once fighting ceased, stripping armor, weapons, and valuables from the fallen. In fact, This immediate looting was considered part of the spoils of victory. For example, after Hannibal's crushing victory at Cannae in 216 BC, Carthaginian troops collected gold rings and other trophies from the slain Romans. The Roman historian Livy describes Roman battlefields where the dead were plundered so thoroughly that not a single weapon or piece of armor remained when locals later came to bury the bodies. Any metal equipment was simply too valuable to leave behind. Archaeology confirms that very few weapons tend to be found on ancient battle sites. Nearly everything useful was scavenged, either by the army or by locals soon after the battle. What remained were broken shields, splintered spears, and of course the corpses. Enemy bodies were often piled into pits or mass graves without ceremony, or left for locals to handle. As harsh as that sounds, it was an improvement on simply letting them rot under the open sky, which did happen when armies had to depart quickly. With the decline of Rome and the rise of medieval kingdoms, the same basic patterns continued, though now influenced by the Christian belief in the sanctity of burial. In the Middle Ages, it was considered a Christian duty to bury the dead after a battle. Yet religious duty was often not enough motivation. Looting remained a major incentive in the medieval battlefield aftermath, just as in ancient times. Soldiers swarmed the field, robbing the corpses of anything valuable: armor, weapons, jewelry, and fine clothing, even killing wounded survivors who were too weak to resist in order to strip them as well. Even when bodies were buried, they were not always buried right away. If an army had to move on quickly, they might leave the task to local people or simply ignore it. Huge battles posed a logistical challenge. There were just too many corpses to deal with efficiently. Medieval chronicles frankly admit that after some large battles, if the battle was very large, or if the winning side wanted to disrespect the bodies of the fallen enemy, they would simply leave them to rot. One notorious example comes from the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Norman sources claim that William the Conqueror buried his Norman knights with honor, but left the English dead unburied. According to a contemporaneous poem, the bodies of King Harold's defeated army were left to be eaten by worms and wolves, by birds and dogs. The Norman victors, for their part, were in a hurry to secure England, and may have left the battlefield largely untouched, except for stripping valuables. Once the initial flurry of looting and pursuit was over, medieval commanders did sometimes turn to burying the dead. Often this meant digging large mass graves on or near the battlefield. For example, after the Battle of Visby in 1361, the victorious Danes eventually dug huge pits and tossed the Swedish bodies in by the hundreds, burying even the fallen warriors' armor with them in their haste. Archaeologists excavating Visby's mass graves in modern times were astonished to find skeletons still wearing pieces of armor, a direct result of how long the Danes delayed cleanup. By the time they returned to bury them, the bodies were so decomposed that stripping armor was hardly worth it. But what about the dead on the winning side? Even if victorious, battlefield burials were often quick and anonymous. Common soldiers slain in battle might simply be covered over in large trenches without markers. Medieval religious orders sometimes stepped in to handle the dead when armies would not. There are accounts of monasteries near battle sites organizing the collection and burial of bodies as an act of Christian charity. For instance, after the Battle of Crecy in 1346, villagers and monks from nearby towns gathered many of the French dead and buried them. King Edward III had already buried his own English soldiers. Despite such efforts, it was not uncommon for skeletal remains to turn up years or decades later. One traveler in the early 1500s wrote of finding bones still scattered on the field of Agincourt from the battle almost 100 years earlier, the legacy of unburied or shallowly buried victims of that battle. But what about burning the corpses? Burning of bodies was actually relatively rare, which might have been for the simple fact that firewood could be scarce and quite labor-intensive to gather. Medieval chronicles tend to gloss over the gore, focusing on heroics rather than aftermath. But hints of the truth slip through. In one of the worst scenarios, after the Battle of Achilles in 917 AD, the victorious Bulgarians left the Byzantine dead unburied. Even 70 years later, travelers could see the bones of the dead whitening on the ground. So, who did clean up ancient and medieval battlefields? The answer is that it was usually left to the victors, assisted by whoever lived nearby, and their motives were a mix of religion, practicality, and profit. Once a battle was over, the winning army's lower-ranking soldiers and camp followers swarmed over the field to loot valuables and salvage usable equipment. Honor and religion dictated that comrades be buried. Money ensured that weapons and armor were gathered up. But there was often no incentive to thoroughly clean, so to say, the field beyond that. As a result, travelers years later could sometimes stumble upon the eerie sight of bones or skeletons, a stark reminder of bygone battles that no one had fully tidied away. If you found this video insightful, consider subscribing to stay up to date on our latest releases. What would you like to see covered next?